Welcome to the Living After Faith podcast, here to help you recover from the damage of religion and move forward with your life, putting the emphasis on living after faith. This is the official podcast of recoveringfromreligion.org. Now with today's program on Living After Faith, here's Rich and Deanna Joy Lyons.
I'm Rich Lyons.
I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
So today we are talking to two people at the same time. I know we don't normally do this, but we were lucky enough to have a couple of rad skeptics in town. Please welcome to the show Desiree Schell from the show Skeptically Speaking, a syndicated radio show out of Canada, also podcasted, and Rebecca Watson from the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe show, which you may be familiar with. And she also writes for skeptic.org, among many other awesome things in the community. Thanks for being here, guys.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us.
One of the neat things about atheism is you're no longer dealing in the unverifiable belief. One of the things, you come into atheism and now suddenly you're saying, I demand evidence for things. I was a pastor for 20 years, Christian for 42, until I finally allowed myself to require evidence. And that changed things. So what we really want to do today is talk about skepticism itself and how it relates to atheism, and how it's different from skepticism or from atheism.
That is a huge question that you have there that you may not realize is actually really controversial within the skeptics community at this point. Some people think that skepticism, let's call it scientific skepticism. Some people think that that's based on empirical truth, and that I agree. It's a huge issue among skeptics, mostly because there are a lot of skeptics who want to reach out to as many people as possible, and they focus on topics like Bigfoot, aliens, and sometimes more serious topics like the anti-vaccination crowd, or 9/11 truthers or global warming, topics like this that, amongst the skeptics community, we side on the side of science. Whatever the scientific consensus is on these issues, that's usually what we go for. So when it comes to religion, suddenly you're tackling a topic that isn't just a widely held belief, but it's a passionately held belief. And it's the kind of thing where someone could hear about the skeptical community and say, oh, that's really interesting. Bigfoot's fun. The scientific search for Bigfoot. Yeah, why not? Oh, wait, they're also a bunch of atheists. And no, that's not cool because I don't agree with that. And turns out I don't like them at all.
I actually had a woman I work with. I had mentioned I was going to a Skeptics in the Pub meetup. And, I told her, they're a lot of fun and really informative. And, if it's something you think you'd be into, I'd be happy to take you along. And she goes, oh, no, I can't be a skeptic because I'm a Christian. And, I was like, oh, that's right. That's how people kind of see it. And, it's an interesting place to be, actually, because I'm an atheist and a skeptic. And I want everybody to to see the things I'm seeing and learn the things I'm learning. I want to show them pictures of dolphins, and I want to show them the.
It's well known that Lisa Frank was an atheist. No pictures of dolphins? Am I the only one who had Lisa Frank?
Women of a certain age. Oh, that's right, with those horrible unicorns and the rainbow colors.
That's what I think of when I think pictures of dolphins. But yeah, it is exactly that problem. We want to reach out to people, but and you can kind of see it from both standpoints. On the one hand, we don't want every Christian or every theist out there to write us off. However, we are using skepticism when it comes to religion. We try to apply it. Many of us try to apply skepticism to every facet of our life. And, so there's this argument. Should we include religious discussions at our skeptics conferences or should we not? I personally think that the answer is to publicize the fact that we are not perfect, that calling yourself a skeptic doesn't mean that you have the right answer on every topic, because I think that everybody in our community has a weird belief. They probably don't know it. They probably haven't gotten around to skeptically examining that belief.
And so I think we just need to admit that none of us are perfect Vulcan skeptics. So it's okay for you to be religious and be part of this community. It's even okay for you to believe in aliens and be a part of this community, because what we're really about is the question, not about the answer.
Well, but let's go back here for a second, because would you really say that the only reason that there's a controversy around whether skepticism really constitutes atheism, that it's only a recruitment issue? Because that's not the sense that I get.
Well, I think when it comes to the people who are arguing that we shouldn't talk about it, yes, I know it's a recruitment issue, because this is what they've thrown at me again and again is, stop discussing religion. You're driving people away. I think there are also some skeptics who identify as skeptics who are also religious. They are well in the minority. There is a huge overlap between skepticism and atheism. Make of that what you will. And I think some of them have a point in that they want a little bit of respect. They don't want to be ridiculed. They want to go to these conferences to be ridiculed. And, I get that. But there is an argument to be made of, well, is this ridicule, or are you just insulted that I'm criticizing your deeply held and cherished belief? Which is exactly what a lot of even atheists worry about, is offending these religious people, driving them away from our movement. So yeah, I think that the issue, as it's mostly discussed, is one of recruitment, because I think the actual people within our movement who identify as religious are a very small minority.
And we want to make sure that we include everyone, which of course everybody's talking about inclusiveness these days. And I think skepticism is really important because there are a lot of bad beliefs that people have about people. People will say racist things or racist things or sexist things, or, make generalizations that actually don't hold up to the science. So saying, all right, we have to question why people believe, for instance, women love to shop because of evolution or that kind of stuff. Because a lot of people, I think, listening to this show are coming out of religion where they weren't really allowed to question a lot of stuff. There were a lot of things where they were told, well, this is true because the Bible says it is, or this is true because my pastor says so. And so they're just starting to come into a world where they go, I can find my own answers. And that's one of the things that I've always found really cool about skepticism is you can ask a lot of questions. And Desiree, I know that's one of your fortes. You're very good at asking questions. What is it that you love the most about searching for knowledge and trying to find out what's out there in the world?
I think I'm potentially emotionally stunted. I never got past the but why phase of childhood development. And I'm very happy that I haven't, because I'm innately curious. I can find anything interesting. If I don't already know about it, it falls squarely into then it's interesting category. But my particular focus, it will always be on neurology or debunking evolutionary psychology, which I think has some issues.
I bet there's a lot in neurology and evolutionary psychology that tell you kind of how our brains work and how we make the mistakes in our thinking that we do. And Rebecca, you talked about this last night in your talk, How to Offend Women with Science, how people will sort of make up a reason for why the prejudice that they have is true.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the problems that we see in the skeptical community is that sometimes we have to understand that sometimes science, which we hold up as this is the ideal method, this is the best tool we have for figuring out what's real from what's not real, we forget sometimes that there are things that happen under the banner of accepted science that aren't necessarily true, that aren't necessarily good science. It's too influenced by our culture and by our own biases. And so that's what we find with evolutionary psychology again and again and again. And I want to say that there's probably some evolutionary psychologists out there who are doing great work, but the stuff that gets the headlines, the pop Evo Psych stuff, is usually they're just so stories. They look at something that they can evaluate, or that they notice happening in our culture. Things like, oh, well, obviously girls prefer pink. And obviously we must have evolved that ability. So let's come up with a story for why that is. Maybe women like picking berries, when they were gathering. And so then they do these studies, and this study is just asking women what color they prefer and asking men and pointing out, look, the women chose pink. Therefore, I'm right. And that's an actual study. That's an actual study that was done. And that was the conclusion they came up with, despite the fact that one segment of the study debunked itself. Because they, my suggestion for what's actually happening is that the colors that different genders prefer is culturally influenced. And we can look back just a couple of decades ago, and we see that pink was known as a boy's color, blue was a girl's color. So that leads me to think that we probably didn't evolve to like pink. And so if you look at this study, one other part of it, they decided to look at a different culture. And this was their way of trying to do good science. We're like, we'll see if the same thing exists in another culture. So they went to China, and they said, look, women prefer pinker colors, therefore done. But if you look at the data, what you see is that men in China also preferred pink. It's just that they thought that the pink that the women preferred was a little bit pinker. But you can see that in China, it's the curve is much, much different. Well, why is that? Possibly because in China, red is a lucky color. And so both men and women were more likely to choose pinks over blues. And so their own study showed a cultural difference, a huge cultural difference between the U.S. and China. But that's not what was presented to the media. What was presented to the media was, we have scientifically proven that girls evolved to love pink.
And see, this is why I love atheists. Now, let me explain. The thing is that people come into atheism for many reasons. We know that. But once you start seeing where the flaws in your reasoning were previously, it tends to leave you more open to seeing the flaws in other kinds of reasoning, whether that be political or scientific or in the media. And so what I find is that atheists are far more ready to think, okay, well, I was wrong about this other thing. I might actually be wrong about other things than that. And so they're much more liable to take something like a presentation by Rebecca and think, okay, well, I was wrong before. Maybe this too.
And I think that brings up a really good point about the difference between someone who identifies as an atheist and someone who identifies as a skeptic. See, because I became an atheist first, and in exactly the way you described, I left home and suddenly realized that it was okay to ask all those questions that I had been told, you go to hell for asking those questions. Jesus doesn't like you to ask those questions. As soon as I left home for college, I was like, oh, religion's bullshit. So I suddenly realized it was okay to ask those questions. But then I got carried away, and I kept asking questions. I didn't stop with, well, now I figured it out. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who do leave religion and they say, well, glad I got that taken care of. No more BS floating around in my head. And so what they've done now is they identify as an atheist and they're happy with the answer. And that's why I mentioned that being a skeptic is about the question, because skeptics then, just as Desiree says, skeptics realize, asking those questions is fun and good and rewarding, because seeking out the answers is in and of itself a reward. And those are the people who I think go on to call themselves skeptics.
I came to skepticism after I became an atheist. I had ruled out the God of the Bible as any viable option. And I am a 6.9 on the Dawkins scale of gods in general, but I'm a 7 as far as the Christian God goes. Can't exist. I can show you in the Bible too many things where he contradicts himself and he can't exist. That one can't exist.
You're so radical.
Well, I am. But it's funny, so I thought I had my, go through this process. I've got 2 shrinks. I have all this, work it out, trying to rediscover who I am, because, my entire life was devoted to the Bible. I owned 100 different Bibles because they had different notes, different translations, I used that. That was my job. I've read it cover to cover 13 times, studied a minimum of 20 hours a week for 20 years. This was my world, so it's gone. And, So I worked through the religion thing pretty well and thought, okay, I've got everything together. And then I meet this lady over here, and we're discussing something, and she discovers that I believe in woo, alternative medicine.
It wasn't your fault. You were around some bad influences.
Yeah. First thing she brings up scientific evidence that refutes, and I don't even remember what it was at the time.
Something ridiculous, some supplement or something that, that's very easy to believe in, because a lot of people believe in certain things, just like the God belief. You go, well, everybody thinks that vitamin C prevents a cold or something. So, of course, even doctors say that. But then you start examining the evidence, you go, oh wow, that's not settled.
Yeah, see, but the beautiful thing about becoming a skeptic is now I look at things with the question, not the answer. And
well put.
I'm welcome to question it, and I'm not locked into answers, so, and I find that so refreshing. But I have noticed a lot of the atheists, especially newly converted atheists, are where I was. They're in that place where they've got the religion question answered, but they haven't really taken that next step to examining skepticism. And, there is a natural link there. And I just kind of wanted to throw it out for discussion. Can you really, have you not just substituted atheism for religion if you don't bring skepticism along and make it more of a, I hate using the word life change, but you kind of have to go there.
Well, skepticism is a philosophical outlook, so it is a life change. It can color how you view everything. And, often, as in many other subcultures, we refer to the matrix sort of idea of, there being this entire world out there that you're not seeing until you remove the glasses or put the glasses on, or, maybe it's
Take
a they live scenario where, is it they live?
They live is with
it
the
is
glasses.
they live.
Yeah,
indeed.
okay. All right.
I came here to
Sometimes chew bubble gum and kick ass,
and I'm all out of bubble gum.
That line was improvised,
I read that.
Yeah.
Very nice.
The IMDb.
Yeah, very nice.
I forget what I was saying now. No, I'm thinking of Macho Man Randy Savage Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Sorry.
Dude.
It's been a while.
And that big fight in the alley where they just kicked the
that
crap
was
out
also
of each other.
not supposed to be in the original. You should really read the IMDb.
Oh my God.
Okay,
really
and since
interesting.
we're bringing up They Live,
Yeah.
that's how I came to skepticism. Not through that movie, but through through politics. Honestly, and I think this is sort of one of those things that we can find our way to skepticism through many different ways, because I am a raging lefty. Not everybody knows, but some people know. It's not really too much of a secret. But during the day, my day job is I'm a union organizer. So I've always been involved in social justice movements, and I've been involved in sort of radical politics. And it's the same thing as I said before. Once you start seeing where all the flaws in your reasoning are, and once you start seeing that maybe all the stuff that you read was not exactly the way things were, once you start seeing that, for me, it's, thinking is kind of addictive. Using your brain is kind of addictive. You start using it in other areas. So I've never been a believer in God. That's just not how I grew up. I went to a couple of different Sunday schools and some interesting stories there, but that was mostly because I was bored. But I don't have the same experiences. So when I hear about a lot of the atheists and humanists that I talk to and some of the things that they've gone through, it is horrifying for me because I don't have those same negative connotations with religion. They weren't fulfilling, but they weren't anything that took a hold of me or affected my life.
Rebecca, you were mentioning some attitudes about things that make baby Jesus cry in your household. What kind of religious background existed there? Was it cultural or was it really strong in your home?
It was mostly cultural, actually. We were Baptists, but not the Southern Baptists. We were allowed to dance.
Ooh,
yeah.
the wild ones.
Yeah.
I just thought of you in Footloose. Just so you know.
That was me, actually. That movie was based on my life,
Totally
it
makes
turns
sense.
out.
Cool.
So, we were the type of family we went to church every Sunday while we were kids, and then that drops back to the major holidays and then go if you want. But my mom still cried when she found out I was an atheist. So it's that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, but there was still, despite that, there were still times when I would go to, and I was really into it. I was in youth group and I went to snow camp and stuff. But there were still questions that I had that I would go to my, youth pastor or whoever and say, this doesn't really make sense. And the answer was never satisfying. And when I was a kid, yeah, it was usually things like I remember I used to sit in church when I was a kid and it was so boring. I hated it. I had to wear those scratchy pantyhose and the dresses. Oh, hated it. And I would get bored and I would always flip to Revelation. And my mom would say, no, you're not allowed to read that. But I'm like, it's in the Bible, Mom. And she said, well, God doesn't like for little girls to read that part. And I'm like, it's the only good part. Come on. So there were a lot of just little details. And also, this is something I was just talking about with some friends about how I was really into Greek and Roman mythology as a kid. And at some point, it suddenly occurred to me that, oh, wait, did some people actually believe this? Or were they just stories back then too? And I got really confused and I went to my pastor and I just got this answer that was just like, well, they just hadn't accepted the Lord Jesus yet and blah, blah, blah. And then the timelines never made sense. And, it was, and then, as soon as I got to college, the second I got to college, I was like, there are other religions and some of them are dead. And oh my God, and Christianity didn't even happen until what happened to all those people beforehand. And oh my God, it was just like this, the floodgates opened. And it was kind of an awesome experience. And like Desiree said, it's the sort of thing that's addictive. But unfortunately, like you mentioned earlier, we have some prominent atheists that a lot of atheists look up to who are in no way skeptics.
Absolutely.
Bill Maher is always the first one that comes to mind. Bill Maher is very outspoken anti-theist. And yet, he believes that the government is giving you vaccinations to kill you and make you autistic. He believes in no actual medicine.
He's actually sort of questioning germ theory, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Strange.
No, he is not not critically thinking about other areas besides religion, and I'm not even convinced he's thinking critically about that because
that is exactly where my question and where I kind of wanted this episode to go is, I don't want to sound judgmental of anyone, but if your atheism simply stands because you left religion for whatever reason and haven't built it up from a skeptical examination of that religion, and in the process of turning your whole life over, as you mentioned, that's a whole lifestyle. Your philosophy of life has to change here. I don't know if you don't really take that step, is the journey incomplete?
I mean, to me, I would say yes, and Desiree is shaking.
I'm nodding furiously.
Yeah, yes, nodding. That's the word. I think that, and you're right. It's difficult because you don't want to be judgmental, and I think this about people who call themselves skeptics but are religious. It's easy for me to say you're just not being skeptical about your religion, but I have to admit that there's why can't I just say that they have used the tool of skepticism and they have applied it to what they know and they have come to a different conclusion than me.
And again, we all have cognitive dissonance around specific issues. So I don't think you have to be judgmental when you say this. You can say that's part of it. It's part of it. As you said, the journey is incomplete.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I do is, I communicate to an audience about issues of skepticism and atheism and secularism. And what I find interests me the most is not whether or not more people are going to identify as atheist. If anything, I only look forward to that because that might gain us some political credibility, that might give us the ability to have a bit more control over government, things like that. But ultimately, and that betrays what I'm about to say next, which is that my ultimate goal is simply for the world to become a better place, because I'm a humanist, and not all atheists are humanists, but I believe that there's, atheism is simply the fact that I don't think there's any such thing as a God. that's useless. Who cares? What matters to me is where do we go from there?
Absolutely.
And so, this is what I mentioned earlier about then proceeding on to calling yourself a skeptic. Well, we also have this other path, which is also, going forward and saying, what can I do? How does atheism affect my worldview? And for me, that said, I've got one life. This is it. The people I love have one life. The people I don't even know have one life. And why shouldn't I care about them? Why shouldn't I make this one life as awesome as possible? So now I'm a humanist, and now I'm focused on something positive and making some kind of change in the world, as opposed to simply being satisfied with being an atheist. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that, it doesn't matter to me that someone identifies as atheist. What matters to me is, what are you doing to make this world a better place?
And that is very, very similar to my perspective. And since I don't have belief in my background, and I quite honestly was never really interested in atheism, it had no relevance on me. But it's only come to have relevance on me when we're talking about issues like the HPV vaccine or making abortion illegal or those kind of issues, things that have relevance to my rights and my life. When the church starts infringing on those kind of things, it becomes a lot more interesting to me. It's a lot more immediate.
And that's another path you can take from atheism is into secularism. And that's why that's one of the other topics, I give talks about this, about how the religious right has long ago infiltrated our government and is now conducting this war on women. And there are a lot of atheists who didn't care, because what does that have to do with atheism? What does your right to choose what happens to your body, what does that have to do with me and my atheist meetings and Richard Dawkins? And so what I try to do is point out, what it should have to do with you is, now that you're an atheist, surely it bothers you that religious people are attempting to set up a theocracy that would negatively affect your life. So now come this way, just edge over here a little bit. Now let's call ourselves secularists and let's fight to keep that from happening. They're related issues, atheism and secularism, but one, again, is about positive action moving forward. And that's what's really important.
See, this topic is one of those that I had to reevaluate. And I still find topics. It's so funny because, 42 years I was driven by one concept, and that is the Bible is God's word and it's inerrant. And then all of a sudden I come to a place, now I'm 50, 8 years later from that, and I still find things in my mind. I think, wait a minute, I don't think that way anymore.
Little
Where
nooks
did that
and
come
crannies
from?
with bits of belief stuck in them.
But abortion was one of those
English
things.
muffin of your brain.
I was one of those preachers, and I hope folks will forgive me for this. Can I say it?
I forgive you.
Okay.
All right.
I was one of those preachers who said the only kind of abortion that should be legal is a self-inflicted bullet in the brain of the mother.
Wow.
Oh, you were one of those.
I was one of those.
Wow. Thanks so much for coming to this side. We're glad to have you.
I feel like applauding.
But I had to, the first discussions of abortion that Deanna and I had about it, I was like, but it's murder. And then she was like, introducing, scientific evidence that, if a fetus is not viable, and, where did I get my concept that it's murder? Oh, because life begins at conception. And then, but actually that's not a biblical concept. But anyway, that's where we got it from. So I had to kind of come through this process. And now you say, well, how could someone who was so anti-abortion be pro-abortion now? And in all honesty, I don't consider myself pro-abortion. I consider myself pro-woman. I consider myself a feminist. The only person who has the right to decide is the person who owns that body. I mean, that is so simple to understand. And, I find it hard in my own mind to separate that understanding from secularism, because the only place the prohibition came from in the first place was religion. And if I have determined through skeptical analysis that religion is wrong, then I've also got to accept the possibility that everything it introduced to our society is also wrong.
So how do you feel now about LGBTQ issues then?
Totally, I am not gay. I am straight, but maybe, right?
Wow. You just looked at her for approval. That was great.
I think we just learned something really interesting.
I've always been told I have too many shoes for a straight guy. These are bad. These are my walking shoes. But
Yeah, those are straight man shoes.
I really feel that we have to, as atheists, adopt the LGBT issues. I am pro-gay marriage, have been way out there for a long time. And the reason for that is just simply, where did the prohibition come from?
Absolutely.
If it just comes from religion, which it does, and I have been out there on the podcast, I have been on commercial radio saying, if anyone knows of a viable argument against homosexuality that is not based somewhere in religion, that has a viable, here's why this is wrong, I want to hear it. And no one has come up with an answer.
This is an interesting point to get back to the fact that not all people who call themselves skeptics skeptically evaluate every area of their life. And one, usually it's I think both Desiree and I have found that when it comes to human rights issues and, LGBTQ feminist issues, that's usually where we find that. And so, I have seen atheists attempt to make an argument against, homosexuality in general by saying it's not natural. They use this the naturalistic fallacy. They use they think they're using biology, and of course, when you point out that there are tons of other species that do all sorts of fantastically wonderful looking crazy shit, and then you can also point out that living in buildings is not natural. Driving around in cars is not natural.
I
No
wear
other
glasses.
species do that. Yeah,
Not natural.
Not natural.
yeah, and so you can point this out to them, and many of them just shut their mind off. They can't even imagine that they could possibly
But
be wrong.
is that any different from the religious, I'm shutting my mind off because it's wrong, and I'm told it's wrong, and since it's wrong, I'm shutting my mind off because it's wrong?
I don't think that's a religious trait. I think that's a human trait, is that we automatically try to confirm our bias. That's why there's a whole word for it. We will only confirm the biases that already agree with what we already think. And we'll ignore all the stuff that doesn't agree with the things that we already think. That's just very human. But that's also why we developed science, so that we could get over those kind of biases.
I think that's an important point to hit on, is that in science, the first thing you must do is try not to fool yourself. And that is one of those things that I learned through association with the skeptic community, is that we are super easy to fool, which is why we try really not to look down on when people have beliefs that we think are wrong. We try not to be like, you're just an idiot, because, in the case of living after faith, so many people are coming out of religion. They're like, wow, I was totally wrong before. And now I'm like, I'm going to learn new things and figure out where I was wrong. And cool. Now I get to kind of examine everything.
But I was a red Tory for years.
Wow.
Honestly, it's okay. We all go through those weird phases. Cut yourself some slack. You're coming around to the right side.
It's something I've been arguing for a number of years in talks. I would try to push this idea that the skeptical movement, if it is a movement, you can call it a community, whatever, but we're only going to grow and reach large amounts of new people if we can embrace skepticism as a compassionate act, as opposed to it being an aggressive contrarian act. And unfortunately, and what I always say is that I'm not the person to do that, because I'm a sarcastic jerk. We need people like Desiree. We need people with silky smooth voices and sweet personalities, which Desiree has,
In spades.
Yeah. We need that, because right now, a lot of skeptics are, and a lot of atheists as well, are seen as being confrontational, being aggressive, being confident, overly so, in the stereotypical idea. But there's so much about skepticism that is actually the opposite of that. And one of the reasons why I think we don't have tons of women in our community in general is because we train women from birth to not be confrontational, to not fight, to not tell somebody your belief is wrong. And so, one way that we can turn that on its head. And studies show that this works for getting more women involved in male-dominated roles like IT. Instead of talking about computer tech, they talk about helping people because that's a female trait. What they find is that more women get involved or are interested in getting involved when you sell it like that. And so when we come to skepticism, what we can talk about is how what we're really about is saving people's lives, encouraging them to vaccinate their children, encouraging them to take the drugs their doctor prescribes and not to take homeopathy, which doesn't work. These are compassionate acts. And that's something that I feel like we need to get that message out more, because I think we're going to reach out to more people who otherwise are completely turned off by the idea. Suddenly, this is a good thing.
Well, I can tell you right now, that's exactly why I got involved, because I've been trying to save the world since I was, 12 years old. And if I didn't think that skepticism had a hope of doing that, I wouldn't be involved, because there's enough other areas that I already work in that kind of do that. I have a very fulfilling life. And this is, skepticism, I think, has a lot of possibility behind it. And if we're heading in the right direction, I'm just going to keep saying that. It's not perfect, but it's something better.
It encourages me to hear you say that, because one of the things I struggle with myself, and I don't keep my struggles secret here, is, am I doing the same thing just under a different flag? For 42 years, my God-given mission was to save the world, and I'll be damned if I let that be my mission now. Although I find myself standing up for LGBT issues, considering myself a feminist and taking a stand that most guys scratch their head at. I find myself in the same place saying, here we have these people, and I can save the world. And, but then again, here's you with no religious background, and you're saying, the same thing. Maybe what I'm trying to say here is that what I'm considering a human trait and trying really not to be a part of, or what I'm saying is a religious trait, I'm really trying not to be a part of that, could just be a human trait. Maybe it is okay.
Let me tell you a story. So when I was younger, I dated a priest. Don't worry, he was Anglican. They're allowed. And we had many conversations about this. And I was definitely, I was a self-identified humanist at that time. And we had lots of conversations about whether God did or did not exist. And by the end of these conversations, it was very clear that he wasn't quite sure. And I asked him, well, if you sound like really that you're an atheist, so do you feel like you can still be a priest and be an atheist? And he said, ultimately, it doesn't matter. I'm doing what I want to do. I'm helping people. So to me, it became, as long as you're trying to do good, that's more important to me.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then maybe what you need to do is you need to rebrand it. You don't have to save the world. Just make the world a little better.
Just a little.
Just a little bit. And, if everybody gets together and does that, what more could you ask for?
Very good.
You don't need religion to do that. But some people do for the moment.
In so many places, religion actually hurts the process.
It does.
By creating gender bias, by creating
otherness, by isolating people by traits that don't really matter in the real world.
Right. And the guy I'm talking about, this dude had, the Anglican church, it was in Vancouver. There were floats in the Pride Parade. It was one of those churches. So
very welcoming, very liberal, very cool. Yeah.
So I don't think he was typical in any way.
Right.
But there are religions that hurt. And it wasn't until I started reading, it wasn't until I came into skepticism and started reading more about atheism that I realized how really naive and sheltered I was about a lot of issues. Because to me, religion was always something that was just sort of peripheral, like, oh, that's funny.
Most people don't do
Christian.
that.
That's cute.
Yeah.
How quaint. But that's about it. And then I hear stories about people living in sort of isolated communities in small towns in other countries. And religion is not something to be trifled with.
Yeah.
That's not every religion in every community. But it's frightening in a lot of places. And again, since I come at this from a political perspective, when people are talking about putting rules on my vagina, I have a problem with that.
Especially, well, yeah, I have a problem with it at all. But especially when the basis for their reasoning for wanting it is clearly absurd.
Clearly.
I mean, the only reason is because that's their current viewpoint of what the Bible says. You know, even though, I mean, traditional marriage, one man, one woman. Okay, that's not traditional according to the Bible. That was radical new preaching that some idiot named Paul introduced long after Jesus had done his bit and the disciples were gone. I mean, you look at the overall, even and people who listen to the podcast know my viewpoint. The only actual person I think in the Bible that actually existed was probably Paul. The rest of them are all fictitious characters, but Paul probably actually existed. But when you take that reason for wanting to put rules on your vagina and tie it straight to a guy who was trying to create a religion because he was pissed off with the current group, and today, 2,000 years later, we're still branded with that opinion and that regulation. That pushes me over the edge. You know, it's wrong enough to want to regulate your vagina, but it's beyond comprehension to want to do it for such an absurd reason.
Yeah, I mean, religion is a tool, you know, and you know, they're going to use any tool they can get. And religion happens to be a really useful one because it's a way to drive your point home by tapping into a ready-to-go base of people. So if you hate the gays and you happen to be the head of a mega church, I mean, you have a huge amount of control behind you. Religion's a really easy way to convince people to do anything. Because it's the ultimate idea, you know, it's where you go when you die. It's the thing that controls your every move. I mean, it's a brilliant scam, you know, it's a brilliant scam.
It is really the most important question ever. If the question is, am I going to spend eternity being tortured or am I going to spend it in bliss? Because if you really believe that, you know, this life really is just an audition for that afterlife, and that what you do now doesn't really matter as much as where you go after you're dead. I mean, that's the probably most scary, biggest motivator ever. And there's a lot of stuff that kind of ties into that. In fact, people talk about all the time how when they left their religion, they still have a really hard time leaving the thoughts of hell behind. Yeah. There's a great deal of fear. I used to lay in bed as a kid and I wasn't even, you know, really that religious, but hell scared the shit out of me. I would just lay there and be like, I don't want to be tortured, but I don't know what's really I'm supposed to do or not do. There's so much.
But honestly, I don't know. I agree. Hell is scary, but my son is an avowed atheist, and those other metaphysical questions are just as scary. Just because you don't believe in hell, you still have this sense that like one day I'm going to die. And what is death? What does that feel like? And I'm assuming that Christian children ask their parents the same kind of questions that my son did.
Yeah.
Which is basically, what's the purpose here?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges and one of the greatest rewards of being non-religious is to suddenly realize that your purpose, you don't have a purpose-driven life. You don't have, your purpose wasn't written in a book thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, tens of years ago, depending on which religion you ascribe to. You have the frightening opportunity to create your own path and to decide for yourself why life is worth living.
And kind of a responsibility to do that. I think, that was one of the things initially, and I think a lot of the people, the feedback we get from the show tells us a lot of someone becomes an atheist, they reach that point, okay, I can't believe this anymore. And then one of the first things they're going to come up with is, okay, so nothing has meaning. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. And but in that process, a book I recommend, highly recommend it. Came across it at the right time. I had read Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dan Barker and, Dennett. I'd read the big ones that you read. And I was at a bookstore and come across this book, a little thin book called The Atheist Way by Eric Maisel. And I thought, okay, that was the only one they had that I didn't have. But it was fabulous because it took it from the perspective, okay, I'm already an atheist. The world's meaningless. Now what the hell do I do with this? And steps you through the process, number one, of appointing yourself, giving yourself the right to choose what has meaning for yourself. And then number two, how to do that. What has meaning for you? And I highly recommend that book, but it gives life so much more meaning. When you think that I have the greatest wife on the planet, it wasn't something some God planned out before either of the sperms that created us existed.
Wait, you mean I'm not the bride of Christ chosen for you something, blah? Yoked.
It's funny. Two different prophets after I left the Pentecostal church prophesied that my next wife would fulfill to me all of the requirements that the bride of Christ was going to fulfill for Christ.
Well, that's nice.
And then here she is. She's an atheist. She's a skeptic. She's
a dirty girl.
Yay.
I heard the bride of Christ is the same.
Excellent.
I bought my son a picture, and please, people, like Dennett and Hitchens and Dawkins are lovely and all that, but read A Softer World. It's a webcomic. And it's a 3-panel. In the first panel, it says, life is meaningless. And then the last panel, it says, might as well be nice to people.
It's good a philosophy,
Perfect.
isn't he?
Love it.
Yeah.
I like that.
Absolutely.
So where do you want to see things go with the skeptic movement and the atheist movement? I feel like we're at the beginning of a place that what we do now, we're really not going to see the results ourselves, but we're going to set a path that 1,000 years from now, people can look back and say, we either really did a great job or we really fucked it up.
I disagree. I think we will see the results in our lifetime. Absolutely. But I agree. We are at a crossroads, and what we do now is going to determine how effective we can be. Because all social movements have been down this road where they sort of splinter into where they want to go. And skepticism right now is sort of one group wants to take the path of scientific skepticism, where they want to study Bigfoot and homeopathy and UFOs, and some of those are, to me, more urgent than others, but nonetheless they're valid. But the other group wants to take on things that we think are more urgent to be skeptical about. And some of those have to do with social issues. And it's not about taking on an ideology, but it's about using skepticism as a tool to take on certain things. Like, for example, if we're talking about, let's say, the war on drugs, to talk about how effective policy has been in terms of actually affecting the war on drugs. If you want to look at policy changes using science and using statistics, there are tons of ways that we can take on a lot of these issues, like the HPV vaccine. Rather than looking at it from an ideological point of view, we can actually look at, is it working? And that's a very skeptical point of view to debunk myths. And there are lots of myths that surround social justice issues. So I think, and I don't know if Rebecca would agree, but I see that there are two very divergent directions that they're heading.
I do agree. And I think that our side, the social justice side, is going to win out because we tend to include under that banner those urgent issues of scientific skepticism, things like vaccines, stuff like that. Because what we're focused on ultimately is making a good difference in the world. How can we do the most good, in the shortest time? And so what I think is going to happen is that the other side, the Bigfoot side, I think they're going to become irrelevant. I think they're going to die out because they are not reaching out to new people. They're not showing why what they're doing is important to people's lives as anything other than a fun side hobby. And so I think that as we continue to grow and actually change what's happening in the world, I think they're going to dwindle and just eventually just be, just a silly, jokey side culture.
And I love a lot of people on the other side. Let me be clear. Love them. That being said, I am unapologetically wanting to change the world.
People are always going to believe weird things. They're always going to believe wrong things. That will never be able to change that. And as long as people believe wrong things, there will be people who want to take advantage of that. And then Scientology. So, that can happen in a couple decades, so no, we're never going to be rid of religion. What I can see happening in the foreseeable future is seeing an end to religious control of social and political life. I think that's something that we can achieve.
I think Rebecca is a little more optimistic than I am, which is good. I don't know if we can achieve that. I don't think we can say that there's going to be an end to that. But what I would like to see is less. Just less. I'll take less. Because that side, there's a lot of issues at hand here. It's not just religion. It's also the money. And the money is pushing the religion, and the religion is pushing the money. So that's hard. But the fact that we do have that drift, we do have people drifting away from religion for many, many reasons, not the least of which are the LGBTQ issues. That's sending people away in droves, because the more gay people there are, the more people know gay people. And so when they go to their church and they hear that, the church hates this, and this happens to be their best friend or their coworker or their sister, what we're talking about is emotional resonance. That's you can't have cognitive dissonance around a person that you love. You love that person. And when an industry, when a body is telling you that is bad, you're going to go with who you love. That's just, we're human. That's the way we are. So I think that there will be that natural drift, just not quite fast enough for me.
That is beautiful. Love is going to win out.
Absolutely.
I'm Rich Lyons.
I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
You've been listening to the Living After Faith podcast, the official podcast of recoveringfromreligion.org. The music in this episode is Rosecross by Morrison's Prophecy. You can follow on Twitter at LAF with me, like Living After Faith on Facebook, or go to livingafterfaith.com. Thank you for listening to Living After Faith.